'Cause fishing, it's in my soul.
Welcome to the Salt Strong Podcast, disrupting fishing entertainment as you know it. Prepare to laugh. Prepare to get to know fishing legends in a whole new and unfiltered way. And on occasion, you might even learn a thing or two about fishing. Here's your host, Joe Simons. Like diamonds.
It's hot weather out, the water temperatures are up, and you just want to go out on the water and target flounder and be successful. Maybe bring something back for dinner that night or for the weekend. You want to get the kids on a nice bite, but things just aren't cooperating. Well, welcome to August and September flounder fishing along the entire coast of the United States. It can be a difficult time to target these flatfish, but it can also be among the most productive times of year to go out and target the flounder. So that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. Hey guys, Rich Natoli here, back again with another episode of the Salt Strong Podcast. And as I mentioned, we're talking fluke fishing or flounder fishing in this one. And we're going to talk about it specifically from the perspective of August into September, really even into early October flounder fishing, and what you need to do or what you need to know in order to get the most productivity possible out of every hour that you're out there on the water. So I'm going to go through some things that you need to consider or you should consider before you hit the water so that you can really set yourself up for success. And the first thing that I'm going to mention is flounder or fluke. I will use those interchangeably throughout this entire episode. It's going to drive some people crazy, but here's what I'm specifically talking about. I'm talking about a summer flounder. This is typically going to be a flounder. It can be found all the way down to the upper part of Florida, all the way up the entire East Coast. The southern flounder, which will go up to maybe Virginia or Maryland, and then down around Florida and into the Gulf, and then the Gulf flounder, which is going to go throughout the entire Gulf of Mexico and around the tip of Florida and out to the East Coast a little bit. So these are the three species that I'm talking about. So when I say flounder or fluke, I'm talking about any of these. You will want to make some slight adjustments to this depending on where you are. I'm going to look at this generally speaking from the mid-Atlantic perspective. But if you just understand what I'm talking about, you'll be able to apply it to your area pretty easily so that you can be productive when you're going out targeting flounder. So let's talk about the first thing here. Now, this is the most important, and we actually did a podcast on this recently, and we were talking about how to fish in the hot weather and things that you can do to increase your chances of hooking up into more fish. Now, we went through a lot of different tips. There were things about bait sizes, retrieve speeds, the different locations that the fish might be found in. But I want to make sure that we take a look at this specifically from the perspective of fluke fishing. So a couple of things. First of all, let's talk about the ideal temperatures for flounder or for targeting fluke. When are they going to be the most active? Well, what you'll generally find out there on any scientific page is something in the upper 50s into the low 70s. So the most typical range that I see from a scientific source is going to be 58 degrees to 72 degrees. That's when the flounder are going to be most active. They're going to be feeding, and that's where you're going to have the most action on them typically throughout the year. So if you can find water temperatures from 58 to 72, you should have a pretty decent chance, as long as you find the fish, to getting them to bite your lure or bite your bait and hook up. So that's what we're looking at. And I personally, I'm going to change that a little bit. I actually, in my experience fishing the mid-Atlantic in a lot of different areas, I actually narrow that a bit. So I actually call it 64 and I go up to 74. That to me seems to be the sweet spot. That's when, generally speaking, the overall behavior of the species, typically, again, for me, is going to be summer flounder. But that is typically when I'm going to see the most action out of them. So in the early season, when the water's in the upper 40s, low 50s, yes, you can still catch them, but it's going to be a little bit more difficult. It's more of a grind. When you hit that window between 64 and 74, for me, that's the best time. They're most active, and I feel like I get more bites and I get more hookups and more fish at that time of the year. But then you get into this summer part of the year, and that's when the water temperatures start to go up from there. So there was a period in New Jersey, as an example, where the water temperatures were in the mid 80s. Now that's significantly outside of that range of 64 to 74 that I talked about. So that changes the way that they behave and where they're going to be found. And one of the things that you do at that point is you consider why. Well, they get a little bit more uncomfortable in that hotter water. So what they want to do is find an area that's going to be a little bit cooler. And the reason they need the cooler water is that cooler water holds more dissolved oxygen. The more dissolved oxygen that is in the water, the easier it is for these species to breathe. So a flounder sitting on the bottom, letting the water pass over them, not actively swimming around like a pelagic, they're going to want to have more dissolved oxygen in that water. Really, most fish are going to want more dissolved oxygen. But when you're talking about a species like the flounder that's sitting on the bottom, I feel that it's a little bit more important to them. So they'll look for those cooler water pockets. They're going to be found in deeper areas along ledges, down in holes. That's where you're going to find them in the heat of the summer, and that's where you're going to be looking for them. Now, keep in mind, if the entire area is going to have water temperatures, let's say at 90 degrees on average, that's significantly higher than 74 degrees. Well, they're still going to be there, but they're going to be looking at that deeper water. And that doesn't mean that they have to find 20 feet of water. If they're in a flat that's a 2-mile flat, or in a sound and it's a 2-mile sound from end to end, they're not necessarily going to leave the entire sound. But what they will do is come out of the 4 feet of water and they'll find that trench that is down to 6 feet. So they'll start looking for areas like that. So that's important. The relative temperatures also matter. It's not just the actual temperature. If it's 90 degrees and it's 90 degrees all over, well, they're going to stick around in that 90 degrees, but they're going to look for that break from 90 down to 88. If they can find that 2 degree, if they can find that half degree change in temperature, they're going to look for that. They're going to find it, and that's where you're going to find them sitting. So I want you to keep that in mind as we go forward. The temperatures do matter, and in a lot of cases, it's the relative temperature. So it's always good to go to that 64 to 74 degrees that I talked about. It's a very, very general statement. In reality, in practical application of that information, I'm looking at relative temperatures. So if it's above that 74 range, I'm looking for the temperature breaks that are going to bring it down closer to 74 degrees, even if it's only 90 to 88 degrees. If it's below that temperature in the early season, it's below that 64 degrees, I'm going to be looking for the shallower areas or the areas that are going to have that bump to bring it 1 degree closer to the 64 degrees. So it's 55 degree water temperature. If I can find 56 somewhere, that's where I'm going to be looking. So keep that in mind as we go forward. That's going to become absolutely critical for you as you go through the summer. August is often the hottest time in most of the region for the air temperatures, and that just adds into the water temperatures. So temperature does matter. Now, the biggest thing that I want to talk about when we're talking about the fluke fishing or the flounder fishing in August and September is really the size of the baits. The size matters when you're talking about the baits for these particular fish at this time of the year. Now, one of the most important things that you can do is understand the types of baits that these fluke or these flounder will eat throughout the year. So when you look in the early spring, in some areas, it's a spearing bite. So if you are familiar with what a spearing is, it's a very small, thin profile bait fish that's out in the water. So they're keying in at certain times of the year when the spearing are in on those smaller spearing. At that point of the year, these smaller baits that you're presenting out on the water are going to be more productive for you. If you fish the salt strong soft plastics, that's the time of the year that you look at the Slam Shady 2.0 or the mulligan. So you're looking at the 3 and 4 inch size baits. Those are the small spearing size baits. Those are the ones that you have out in the water if you want to match the hatch. Now, in much of the mid-Atlantic, once you get into the area of, let's say, July 4th and after, you start to see the reemergence of peanut bunker. So if you're not familiar with peanut bunker, it's just menhaden. It's just juvenile menhaden, usually around 2 inches, maybe up to 4 inches. It can get a little bit bigger, but those start to come back into the backwaters in greater numbers. So if we take a look at various areas in the region, let's talk about Maryland. Right now, in the first week of August, second week of August, right now, that's where you're starting to see this reemergence of peanut bunker in the backwaters. So it's going to start taking over from the spearing as the primary bait in the backwaters. Peanut bunker have a much larger profile than a spearing. A 2-inch spearing is going to be much thinner, much smaller. It's going to have a much less significant mass to it than a 2-inch peanut bunker. So a peanut bunker is going to start taking over as a bait to use when targeting these fluke. Look at Virginia right now, peanut bunker. The peanut bunker are coming in. They're in there in numbers. They're starting to take over. So they, again, become the predominant. New Jersey, I will say any day now. there are peanut bunker in the backwaters. Look, they're always back there, but they're starting to move in more numbers, and it's getting more and more every day. So I would say any day now is where we're going to start seeing the peanut bunker in the backwaters of New Jersey take over as the primary bait if you want to match the hatch. And let's take a jump up north. So let's say Rhode Island. Rhode Island, you have a little bit of time. So September is typically going to be the time that you're going to see that influx of those peanut bunker. So at that time, that's where you want to start looking at the larger baits. You want to start expanding the profiles. You want to start matching the hatch a little bit, at least in the size of the bait, even if it's not necessarily in the actual profile of the bait. So you start looking at, if you're a bait fisherman and you want to use live baits, start looking at peanut bunker. Go out with a net the peanut bunker. Keep in mind, it is almost impossible to keep peanut bunker alive in a live well for any length of time. So, only catch what you need. Use small, a small net. I usually in the past would throw the net off to the side of the school just so I just get a small number of them, put them in the live well, and they'll last for an hour or so. And then you just move on to the dead baits if you want to continue to use them, or you can use them as chum. The other thing that you can do is go out and look for spot. So spot croaker is what they're typically called. And a spot is going to be a larger fish, a larger profile than the peanut bunker, but it's something that works really well once these flounders start keying in on the larger profiles. So this is a situation where you kind of match the hatch with this natural bait. And a spot is actually, wow, it's really simple to catch. If you have any water that I would say is 15 feet or less in a brackish area, near an inlet in any of the mid-Atlantic states, and you just throw out a sabiki rig, you're probably going to have a really good shot at picking up some spot. Just put it out there, pull them in on the sabiki rig and put those onto a circle hook, and you've got a really good bait for flounder. But spot, because of their larger profile, start to come into prominence as a really productive bait at this time of the year. So that really covers your live baits. The peanut bunker and the spot are what I'm going to use. You could still use the minnows or the killies or the mud minnows, whatever you like to call them. But keep in mind, the profile is now increasing. Those will become less productive as you get into the hotter months of the summer and then into the fall. And it's mainly because the reemergence of the peanut bunker as the predominant bait fish in the areas. Now, if you want to talk about other baits to use, again, because the profile of the peanut bunker and the spot start to take over as the dominant baits in the backwaters, that's where you start to upsize your soft plastics. And this is where people really, they look at me a little sideways sometimes when I say this. When I get into mid-August, when I really start to see those peanut bunker moving into an area in numbers, I'm upsizing my soft plastics. So where I was using 4-inch in the hottest time of July, for example, I'm using a 4-inch typically soft plastic on a bucktail when I'm vertical jigging for these fluke. I'm actually going to change that to a 5 or a 6-inch at the minimum. So at this time, the peanut bunker are just starting to move in. I'm at about a 5-inch. Once they're in numbers and they're just all over the place, and you will see them all over the place once they really inundate the backwaters, that's where I move to a 6-inch soft plastic, typically minimum size, even in the backwaters. Even if I'm fishing 5 feet of water or 10 feet of water or 20 feet of water, it doesn't matter. I'm using those larger baits because that's going to be more in line with the size baits that these fluke are going to be targeting at that time of the year. Some of my favorites to use, I will use things that are a bomber size at the 5-inch, like I said, but once it gets into the 6-inch, I do honestly go really hard towards gulp baits, and I really like the gulp grubs. They give a really good action. They have a very thick body to them, so it gives a little bit more profile to the lure when it's in the water, but it has that tail. And it's all about the tail. Shaking that tail out there in front of these fluke as you're coming down with the current, it's just going to be an awesome way for you to hook up with them. So I'm going with the gulp grubs first. I also like shrimp patterns at that time of the year because, again, they're bulky. They have the thicker body. Now, it's not necessarily going to be gulp that I'm going with. I do use gulp, but they don't have a great action to them. So I would use something like actually the Salt Strong Power Prawn is what I would use most typically when I'm fishing August and I want to use a shrimp pattern. Now, when you do that, make sure that you put a scent on there. So use some smelly jelly, use some Dr. Juice, use some Procure, just use something just to get a little scent on there. Scent isn't the most important thing when you're fishing for flounder. However, it is very important once they take that first bite. It can sometimes give you that extra half a second of them holding it before dropping it. And that gives you a little bit more time to set the hook. It also will mask any odors that are on the lures that you don't want on there that will actually push a fish away or detract from the bite. So use an artificial scent on there. Use something at the very least to mask some scents that are on your soft plastics. Other baits to use? Well, crabs. Crabs are an outstanding bait to use, and I would be upsizing the crabs a little bit in this case. One thing that I do like to do is I kind of treat it like the tog fishing or the blackfish fishing that we do in the mid-Atlantic and the Northeast throughout the fall and the winter. And I like to crush the shell of the crab. I like to make it a little bit mushy. It does kill the crab, so it's not walking around. It's not fighting back when the fluke is coming after it, but it does give it a nice presentation. It's all natural. You have the juices coming out of it, so you have a nice scent to it. So don't be afraid to put crabs on there. As far as which crabs to use whatever's legal in your area. There are certain things that are legal and not legal in certain areas. For me, I do like to use fiddler crabs, and you can use blue crabs if it's legal to use those in the area that you are in as well. But crabs will definitely work well. Artificial crabs work well. Make sure if you're going to do that, though, you use something that has a large profile again. So don't use any of those really small ones that are really small hooks. Use the larger ones. Look at the Z-Man kicker crabs. Use those across the bottom. Those are typically not a vertical jig type of an action on them, but something that you cast out and retrieve. And as it goes along the bottom, the tail on that's why it's called the kicker crab, will kick and will kick up little puffs of sand or mud on the bottom, and it'll give a nice visual to the fluke as it's going through the water. So that'll cover the baits, but that last point and the last thing that I said about those crabs is really important. It'll give that nice visual when it's kicking through that sand and kicking up that mud. And that goes right into this next one. And that's the clarity of the water. The water is critical when you're talking about flounder fishing. Now we know flounder are definitely ambush predators. They will lay and wait for the bait to come to them, for their prey to come to them, and they'll jump up, snatch it, and then settle back down. Water clarity is critical. They are not the species that is primarily feeding by scent or by taste in the water. They are primarily feeding by visuals. So if you're in the water and you look down and you see you have 1 foot of visibility, just know that you have to get that bait within 1 foot of a flounder for it to work. So that changes a couple of things. You look at the colors that you're using. You look at the visibility in the water, and you need to find something that's going to stand out in that darker water or that dirtier water. Or you can find a place that has clearer water, so that can limit you to certain tides. In a lot of places, the incoming tide is going to work really well. But if it's coming in really fast, it can start to get that water murky again. So look for the tide cycle that's going to work best for you and give you the cleanest water. That will absolutely increase your chances of catching these fish. If you see a current seam coming off of a point, and one side is murky and the other side is clear, go into the clear. That's where you want to be. And often what you'll find in that case is right along the current seam, the flounder will sit in the murky water with its head right up against that clear water, and it'll be watching everything, have a great view of everything out in the clear water, and it'll spring its attack from the murky water. So look for those current seams. Look for the water clarity, because again, they are mostly visual feeders and visual predators. So you want to make sure that you really align yourself with that. If you find really murky water, some things that you want to do, you can look at the colors, right? I mentioned you could look at the colors. Well, there's a couple ways to do it. You can either go bright and hope that it can kind of blast through the murk in the water. So that's where chartreuse comes in, right? If it's not chartreuse, you ain't fishing. Well, that's one of the reasons that chartreuse works really well in a lot of the mid-Atlantic areas in the Northeast, is because we have such strong tides and we have such dirty water, such murky water. The chartreuse tends to really gather that sun and reflect it out through that water, so they can at least see that something is moving just out of their visual range, so they can go up and they can investigate it. The other thing is to look at profiles. And in that case, in the murkier water, what I like to do often is go with the darker profiles, because what that does is it sets it off. Instead of being brighter, it's darker. And when they see something moving through the water that's darker, it helps them to key in on it. So look at things like a gold digger color, something that's in a black, something that's in a blurple, something that's in a dark blue or a purple. Those will work really well in that type of a situation. So the deeper the color, the more that it's going to stand out in that murky water. And the last thing that I want to talk about, this is always important. Again, I just talked about how these are ambush predator fish. They're visual predators. Well, take a look at the structure that's in the area and really consider that. Really think about what that structure is and think about the fact that not all structure is created equal. For example, if I tell you that you can fish one of two places, a ledge from 3 feet of water down to 12 feet of water, or a ledge from 3 feet of water down to 12 feet of water, which one are you going to take? Well, you'll say, Rich, they're the same exact thing. I'll fish either of them. Well, if I add into that a little bit more detail, I say, yes, but on A, the current is going perpendicular to the structure. So it's coming off of the 3 feet and it's dropping down to the 12, or it's going parallel to it. It's going right along the current. The current's going right along that ledge from 3 to 12 feet. So it's kind of going in a parallel fashion to it. Which one are you going to pick? Well, in that case, you're clearly going to pick A because you want to have that water sweeping from that shallow down into the deep. And that way it's bringing down all of the forage, all of the bait fish from up high, down low, right into the mouth of that waiting flounder. So not all spots are created equal. And when you look at it, you have to look at how does the structure impact the flow of the current in the area, and how does that current influence where the bait fish end up as they're coming through that current. So you want to find a place where it's going to bring the bait fish into a predictable area through or over or around that structure into a spot where the fluke can face into the current on the bottom, camouflaged. So if you're in an area that there's really not even a place for a fluke to sit and stay face into the current in a predictable area for that bait fish to go, well, you shouldn't be there. Think about this from the perspective of a nearshore wreck. So a nearshore wreck can be an outstanding place to catch flounder, but you have to think about where. So if you have a sunken ship and there's a hole in the middle of the ship, are they going to be right down in that hole? Let's say it's a hatch, an old cargo hatch. Are they going to be down deep inside that hull, down in the bottom where there's no current? Well, they could be, but not most likely. They're most likely going to be structure adjacent. So they'll be on the outside of that structure where the current is hitting the hull of that boat and it's sweeping around in a predictable fashion to a predictable place where the flounder can sit on the bottom, face into the current, and can snatch up the bait as it comes by. It's just a food delivery system. It's a lot easier for them. That's what they want to look for. So think structure adjacent, and that will help. And then if you add structure adjacent with predictable currents, that's going to help even more. So those are the things that I'm looking for. So I covered a few things. We talked a little bit about the temperatures. The relative temperatures is really the most important thing. We talked a little bit about the range of temperatures that the summer flounder specifically prefers. But again, focus in on the relative temperature and the temperature breaks. Look for something that's going to be on the correct side of more comfortable in comparison to the current temperatures. So if they prefer 75 degrees of water and the temperature is 80 degrees in the water, look for something that's anything under 80. That's going to be an area that's going to naturally draw these fish. The big thing for me is the bait sizes. Keep an eye on the bait that's in the water in your area. The big example that I use for this one is peanut bunker. As they reemerge into the backwaters at this time of the year, the natural instinct of the predator fish that are in the backwaters is going to be to look for a larger profile fish. So that's where you start to change your baits. You start to go up from those 3 and 4 inch sizes to the 5, 6, 8 inch size baits. So peanut bunker and spot are great live baits or great natural baits to use. And then for soft plastics, I start looking at those large, specifically gulp baits like the gulp grubs. And I start to look at the power prawn as a really good, even though it's a smaller length than the 6 inch soft plastic, it has a lot of bulk to it, a lot of heft to it. If I want to use a shrimp pattern, I'm typically going to use that first. Then look at the water clarity. This one is often overlooked, but look for the water clarity. Flounder are visual feeders primarily, so you want to have an area where they can see that bait from a distance. Otherwise, you're going to have to essentially hit them on the nose so they can see it. So look for the area that's a little bit more clear, and that will absolutely increase your chances of hooking up these fish at this time of the year. And the last thing is the structure. Not all structure is created equal. Look structure adjacent and look for areas where that structure is going to make a flow of current into a very predictable area so these fish can sit on the bottom and they can just take advantage of a food conveyor belt, transferring their next meal directly into their mouths so they don't have to work really hard to get it. So that'll cover it, guys. Hope this helps you out. Looking forward to hearing how you do as we go through this hottest month of the year, typically August, and then into the more comfortable month of September. So until next time, get out there, get on the water, and get some tight lines.
'Cause fishing, it's in my soul.